Hello, and welcome to the Homeschool Sanity Show, your prescription for happier, healthier homeschooling. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Wilson, Christian psychologist turned homeschooling mother of 6. Let's get started. Hey, homeschoolers. Types of government have been in the news lately, but I'm going to be honest and say I don't understand the forms of government that well. That's why I invited a guest expert to explain it so we can teach our kids. To understand what's happening in politics and world relationships, we need to start with this foundation. But first, I want to thank my sponsor, CTC Math. Are you looking for a new math curriculum? CTC Math specializes in providing online video tutorials that take a multisensory approach to learning. Favorably reviewed in Kathy Duffy's 102 Top Picks and the Old Schoolhouse Crew Review, the lessons are short and concise to help your children break down concepts and appreciate math in a whole new way. The lessons are taught the traditional way, not to a test. Each one of the video tutorials is taught by an internationally acclaimed teacher, Pat Murray, who is renowned for teaching math concepts in a simple, easy-to-understand way, and in only a few minutes at a time. Using a multisensory approach, having the combination of effective graphics and animation synchronized with the voice of a friendly teacher together with practical assessment. This three-pronged attack makes learning so much easier and more effective. Even students who struggled with math are getting fantastic results, and ones who were doing okay before are now doing brilliantly. Visit ctcmath.com today to start your free trial. Now let's discuss world government. My guest today is Jessica Degree. Jessica is a high school teacher, former homeschooling student, and the host of a new history podcast called My Life Under Communism. The podcast features interviews with residents or former residents of communist countries, allowing us to access stories of their unique experiences that shed light on an otherwise lofty and complex political term. Her family is the creator of the homeschool history publisher, The Classical Historian, an award-winning history curriculum company. I think you'll enjoy this interview. Jessica, thank you so much for joining me here on the Homeschool Sanity Show. I would love to have you introduce yourself to my audience and tell us about your homeschooling background.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. I was homeschooled in elementary and middle school up until high school. And at the time, unfortunately, there wasn't a program that allowed me to play at a public school sports and then homeschool at the same time. So I was kind of forced to go to school so that I would be able to participate in sports. And I love basketball. So I went to the public high school and I played basketball all 4 seasons and, took some classes, did well, went to Hillsdale College, ended up playing basketball there and majored in English and Spanish. And my Spanish major there kind of took me abroad to Spain several times. So it helped me be exposed to the world outside there and to see a different perspective and to also practice my Spanish. And so that helps me really get interested in other forms of government, specifically communism. My mother grew up in Czechoslovakia, which was a communist country until the Velvet Revolution in 1989. So I have some family history involved with that. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I enjoyed being homeschooled and being able to really have a great community with my family. I'm the second oldest of 7 children. So I have a really close bond with them, and that has allowed me to stay in touch with them, all my siblings. I want one point in time have been abroad. Some of them live abroad now. So it's really helped me, have that sense of community with my family.
Okay. Well, that is a really interesting background that you have. And you are currently living in Boston, is that right?
Yes. I'm currently living in Boston. After I graduated from Hillsdale College, I played basketball abroad, and I also started teaching English. And this is when I found out that I loved teaching. And so after a short season abroad, I came back to the United States, and I really started taking my teaching career seriously. I taught ELA and history in the 5th grade last year. Now I'm teaching high school Spanish at a school in Boston, and really getting to know the area and helping my students learn the wonderful Spanish language that I think will open many doors for them.
That's so cool. Well, our topic today is about something that you touched on when you were introducing yourself, and that is forms of government. Forms of government have been a very hot topic in our country. I would imagine that it's a hot topic in other countries as well, because I know other countries follow our news and politics very, very closely. So I imagine that there has been a lot of conversation, at least in countries that have access to media, right? But I was interested in talking more about forms of government, because I don't know that kids today get a very good education in that. I can tell you that, as a public school graduate, I actually attended a private college for my undergraduate, then a public university for my PhD. And I really was not taught about capitalism versus socialism versus communism. I really had a very poor education in that. And, maybe it's better now, but I don't know. I don't know if it is. I can tell you from my own experience going to a public high school that it's not much better. Okay. All right. Well, tell me more about what really got you interested in it. You said your mother is from Czechoslovakia. What else got you, intrigued about communism in particular as a form of government?
Yes. Yeah. So that's a great question. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, my mom was born in Czechoslovakia, and she grew up there throughout her early life until she was around 20 or in her 20s. And then she came to America after the end of communism. But throughout my life, she never really mentioned much about her youth. She didn't tell us stories about what her life was like, mostly because I think she's not a very proud person, or she puts others first, so she doesn't just dwell on her own past and tell us stories like that. But it wasn't until after college, when I went abroad and I got my teaching certificate in Czech Republic, and I was living with my grandma, when I learned more about communism. I saw a few statues out in public. There's this one beautiful and terrifying at the same time statue that commemorates the victims of communism in a beautiful garden close to the Prague Castle. And I remember I was walking through the city, and it was the 50th commemoration of, I believe it was, I forget exactly the memorial, but it was a really grand memorial day in Czech Republic, and I saw a large procession and with speakers and people holding candles, walking to the statues and placing the candles down, remembering a family member or a loved one who had passed from the previous communist organization. And so this really struck me that, you know, this country and these people were greatly affected by this past that they had. And so I wanted to do more research and find out more about, you know, my own heritage as, you know, a half Czech. And so I went to the Museum of Communism in Prague, which has a very in-depth research and presentation of communism in Czech Republic and its effects. And after then, I started interviewing people. I interviewed 2 people and asked them about their experiences and recorded this. And I actually posted this on SoundCloud. You'll find this today if you look this up on SoundCloud. And it was kind of like the preliminary side of my podcast that I have now, before I even talked to my parents who own the classical historian company that has the podcast and everything. So this kind of really spiked my interest in communism, learning more about my heritage and learning about a form of government that I think has affected many people living in America today and abroad as well.
Mm-hmm. Really, really amazing. So I guess I am just so interested in what is the museum like? I mean, does it have a negative spin, or is it balanced?
Yeah, the museum, you know, I would say the museum, I mean, it is balanced. There's no spin on it whatsoever. I would say it presents kind of what happened there in a very factual way. You walk through it as you would walk through a timeline. You start the early stages of communism and communists in the government, and who were voted for by some people, right? And then it takes you through more of the totalitarian or kind of dictatorial side of communism that happened in Czechoslovakia, where the USSR had Czechoslovakia as a satellite state, kind of telling Czechoslovakia what to do. And it showed examples of what children were taught at schools by the communist government, and what people's daily lives looked like, what a trip to the grocery store looked like, what school looked like, what parades looked like, what work looked like. I would say that at the end, you know, when the museum talks about the end of communism and the start of a democracy or democratic republic, I would say it's a very positive look at that. You know, changing the government structure for the museum side is a very positive thing. Okay.
All right. Very interesting. Well, before we go any further into this discussion, I would love to have you define communism. Like, that term just gets thrown around now, right? It's kind of like used as a political weapon. But can you give us a true definition?
Yes. Yeah. So definitely communism is thrown around a lot today, and people identify things that are not communist as communist just to get people afraid. I would say communism is kind of 2 different things. The first thing, it's an idea, and the idea of communism is very different than what we've seen as communism in practice, right? What other countries have tried to do with communism. I would say first, the idea of communism is this ideal of having a classless society, meaning that nobody is above another's. There's no upper class, middle class, or low class. Everyone's in the same class. Everyone works to the best of their ability to help the society. The individual is dissolved into the community. The possibly the nuclear family is dissolved into the greater community. Religion is dissolved into the greater community. The original idea of a classless society goes far back beyond what we have as like the 18th century philosophers like Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, who wrote about communism in the Communist Manifesto. Even before then, people had been idealizing society where there would be no class. Thomas More talks about this in his Utopia. Plato talks about this in some of his writings. But more later, when we have the Communist Manifesto being published and individuals wanting to really implement communism, it takes a different shape when put into practice. So Marx and Engels wrote that to create a classless society, one had to destruct private property, get rid of private property altogether, and make everything public. And some governments that did this, like the USSR, for example, is probably the biggest example of this, or China's attempt at communism. But we have the USSR from 1917 to 1991. Try this. I guess some historians call it an experiment, the communist experiment, right? Mm-hmm. Where they have a classless society. The government is supposed to, once there's a classless society, once it's established, the government is supposed to dissolve. But the governments have never dissolved when they've tried this experiment. A government always remains. And because the government always remains, then there's no classless society, because people in government just naturally, because they're making these decisions, it naturally forms this power structure. So a very lengthy description of communism, no. And I hope it wasn't confusing. But its idea is to create a classless society with no government, where everyone is working hard to the best of their ability and contributing to the community and giving up their individuality for the community. In practice, I would say it has never reached this ideal, because there's always remained some governmental structure where some people make the decisions in eliminating private property and having public property. So I won't get into too many details about, in practice versus the ideal, but
okay, very good. And yeah, that's communism. And what's funny to me is that when we started this conversation, I was thinking, I've had no experience with this, but I actually did have an experience. I went to the Soviet Union in 1989 during perestroika, when things were in the process of changing. Mm-hmm. But I remember being shocked by a question that I received from a fellow college student. I was there as part of an educational seminar. Mm-hmm. And we were studying the differences between Eastern and Western psychology. So we visited a psych department in Berlin. I'm pretty sure that's where we were. In Berlin. Moscow is what I meant. Not Berlin. Wow. I was in Germany. I went to a lot of different places, a lot of different countries. But
I can get that. The East and West, there was East and West Germany. So it's I get that.
People are like, what is wrong with you? But okay. So I was in Moscow, and this student asked, where do you get your assessment materials? How do you get those? And I said, we buy them. And that was it was a foreign concept that you would have free access to purchase the things that you need and want. Mm-hmm. And I was stunned walking through their shopping district, because, here in America, even back in 1989, when I was there, if you walked in a shopping district in any of our larger cities, you would see things displayed in the shop windows, like clothing and, maybe if you're like by a sporting goods place, you might see like some tents and, some cool looking camping equipment. And what they had displayed were pens, writing instruments, because these were so valuable to them. One of the students admired a scarf clip that I had on. And I said, here, I want you to have this. And she gave me her pen. And I just about started crying, because it's like, she is giving me something more valuable than what I gave her. It was just so striking. And then the other thing that shocked me was going into a grocery store and literally seeing a bag of cookie crumbs. That was the only thing in the grocery store, because people had already lined up to get the items that had come in, that were imported at the time. And they had already gotten all of that. And so there was nothing, just nothing in a grocery store. Yeah. So that was my experience. Unfortunately, my preparation for this trip was not about, the different forms of government, because I think that would have made it an even better educational experience for me. And I could have asked some questions. Now, the only other thing I will add here is that the same student that I was spending a lot of time talking with asked me why we didn't supply any health care for poor people. And I said, we do, like if you're poor and you are in a car accident or you have any kind of an emergency, you're going to be taken care of. And of course we have services, even outside of emergency rooms, but she had been told that we don't care for the health care of the poor at all. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you said about the grocery store reminded me of, I interviewed this woman who grew up in Hungary, and she said that when she first came to the United States, her father had escaped illegally to the United States before she had, and so she joined her father. And the first place he took her when she came to America was a grocery store. And she walked in and she said that she couldn't move for minutes because she was just in awe at everything being fully stocked and all the fruit looking beautiful and all the vegetables looking fresh. And she said that when she went over to, her father said she could have anything she wanted, and she wanted tomato. And so when she went over to grab the tomato, she said that she was worried if she grabbed the best looking tomato, that she would be chastised for being selfish or not taking the lumpy or the swollen ones. But that to me, like that one story is going to stick with me forever, because when I go to the grocery store, I don't always think about that, of how lucky I am that I can buy what I want and things are stocked. So
right.
Her story is definitely always going to stick with me.
Oh yeah. Wow. I mean, that's just amazing. So let's contrast then communism, which you've explained so well, with other forms of government. And I'm going to let you define those, because I'll probably mess it up.
Okay, that sounds good. So I guess I'll go into just listing out other forms of government. So we have monarchy, which is the rule by one with hereditary passing of power, so kings. We have an oligarchy, which is the rule by a few. We have democracy, which is rule by all, or we also have representative democracy or republic, which is citizens choose representatives. So it's kind of like democracy, but instead of a majority ruling, citizens choose representatives, and then the representatives vote. And then we have a tyranny or dictatorship, which is rule by one, but it's a harsh rule, and that tyrant or dictator he writes the rules, he implements the rules, and he judges the rules. And then, of course, no government at all is anarchy.
Right.
I just had to include that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So describing communism and comparing and contrasting them to these various forms of government is a little difficult because, each country that has tried communism, although there are many similarities between, how it first started in the country and how it went and everything, it's different, right? And the way communism has gone in each country is also different than the idea of communism. Mm-hmm. So I just thought I would use probably the USSR example of communism when comparing and contrasting these other forms of government, because that's the one most people are familiar with. Although some people are familiar with, the Chinese Communist Party as well. But so I want to first start out with talking about monarchy. So a monarchy, like I said, is government where one person rules. It might be similar to a dictatorship because one person is ruling. However, in the past, we've had countries where the countries write laws that kind of check the power of the monarch. So, for example, in England, with the Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215, it limited King John. And so this document ensured the protection of church rights, the protection from illegal imprisonment of the barons in England, access to swift judgment or justice, and limiting the feudal payments to the crown. So limiting the amount of money that like knights or barons would owe the king. And they also implemented a council of 25 barons, which would kind of provide checks against the king. So we have the monarchy, which, some people might say, oh, well, it just depends if the king is good or bad. Well, yes, that might be true in some countries, but some countries also had other things in place to check that monarch. And then we have oligarchy, which is the government structure where a few people rule. An example of this from history is in Sparta. There were two kings, and one king would stay home during war, and the other king would go into battle. And so this is probably the simplest example of an oligarchy because there are two people ruling rather than one. But to compare this with the USSR, in the 1970s, in the USSR, many of the leaders died really quickly, and the Politburo, which was the executive committee, kept ruling the party and the country, and so they kind of maintained power, and it was a smaller group of people maintaining power. So this example of communism, it was similar to an oligarchy at this time in history. Because there were a few people in government kind of dictating the rules for that time period. And then we have democracy, which is the rule by all. Now, the founding fathers in America were afraid of creating just a democracy because then just the majority would win. If 51 people voted one way and 49 another, then the 51 would win, and it would be unfair for the 49 others. But I think the most typical example of democracy would be ancient Athens, where all free men participated in voting. And then we have representative democracy or republic, where citizens choose representatives and they vote for them. So in the modern world, the United States was kind of on the forefront of creating this or bringing this back from the ancient world, where we had, the Roman Republic, I think, was the first that tried the republic. So in the United States, we have 3 different branches of government that provide checks and balances towards each other. One branch writes laws, another executes the laws, and another kind of judges the laws and makes sure they're constitutional. United States is different than just a republic because we also have a constitution that's a written document that's set in, kind of set in stone, although it changes from year to year, depending on the Supreme Court's rulings of certain things or interpretations of things. And then anarchy is kind of fun to talk about. Lawlessness, no government. The Western frontier in like the 19th century is probably a good example of this, the Wild West, where if you were out there, maybe there were laws, but not too many sheriffs that implemented them. So a lot of crazy things happened. Or even Texas, when Texas was a part of Mexico before the Mexican-American War in the 1850s. So before this time, when not too many people lived in Texas, it was a little anarchical because, there weren't too many people there, and so not as many sheriffs enforcing the laws. And then we have a tyranny or dictatorship, which, as most people are familiar with, it's when one person holds all of the power and there's not really anyone checking against him. So he writes the laws, he executes laws, and he judges those laws. He has all of those three powers. And depending on who you talk to and historians you talk to, at certain times, some communist governments or countries have operated more in this way. I know Chairman Mao Zedong, during the Cultural Revolution in China, which was in the 1960s to 1970s, he was afraid that other people in government were trying to usurp him. And so he started eliminating anyone who opposed him. And he created a lot of laws. And he also, the Cultural Revolution, he sent Red Guards, which were kind of younger students. He sent them around to basically, I guess a lot of awful things happened, but he sent them around to scare intellectuals or to gather intellectuals up and basically have them re-educated so that nobody would go against Mao Zedong or what he was teaching. So it was a more scary time in China, in Chinese history. But those are the basic governments: the dictatorship, monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, democratic republic, and then anarchy, which is always fun, scary.
Yes, I know. I have seen people online call the United States a democracy, and then someone will always say, "No, we're a republic. We're not a democracy."
Yes.
So that's a really great reminder.
Going back to our discussion of public school not teaching us about government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you are, as you mentioned, you're a teacher, a high school teacher, and you're also a coach. So what are you coaching in high school?
Yes. Yeah. This is my first year coaching volleyball. I'm coaching JV volleyball at my high school and helping the head coach. I've been a basketball player all my life, but this summer I started playing beach volleyball and I love it. And so due to COVID, we weren't able to have a basketball season, but we're having a volleyball season. And so I'm coaching. Some of my students are on my team, and it's really exciting. So
cool. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
So, you've been a student. It hasn't been that long since you've been a student, and you're a teacher and a coach. What advice can you give to a high school student who is interested in learning more about government and politics?
Yes. Yeah. So government and politics, although they might seem, similar, are a little different. I'd say for politics, I would recommend that you read the newspaper. Maybe start just once a week and choose an editorialist that you really like from the newspaper that perhaps your parents get, and read their articles every week when they come in. I would say it's better to read read an article than to watch news or get on social media, because a lot of times what TV news or social media will try to do is to get you emotional And I think it's never a good idea to make a political decision or judgment based off emotion, right? You want to make sure you have all the facts. So I'd say read a newspaper more. And government, depending on, if you're a homeschool student, if you're in a co-op, if you're at a charter school, or if you're at a public school or private school, I would say, if there are opportunities for you to join sort of some clubs for learning about government, like Model United Nations might be an interesting club for you to join, then I would definitely join that club. And another thing is, not to market my podcast, but
no, please do.
On my podcast, I interview individuals from different communist countries. So if you're interested in learning more about communism, I have a guest from Cuba. I have a guest from Hungary, from Czechoslovakia, from China, and I'm really excited. I'm going to have guests from Vietnam soon. So if you're interested in learning a personal story, a personal account from someone who has lived in a communist country, and I've also interviewed someone from Venezuela. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I would definitely appreciate you listening to one of my podcast episodes.
And where can we find that?
Yes. Yeah. So my podcast is, I have a website on theclassicalhistorian.com. There's a tab for the podcast there. But also it's on any podcast streaming services. It's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Google Podcasts, it's on Spotify. You can find it anywhere. Just look up My Life Under Communism. And there's a symbol of a fist, which is the universal symbol of communism, and a little eagle at the bottom that stands for the Classical Historian, the company my parents founded.
Mm-hmm. Well, fantastic. And I'm going to add those links to the show notes for this episode. Before we go, can you tell us a little bit about your parents' classical historian website and what kinds of resources they have there?
Yeah, sure. So the Classical Historian website is, originally it's a homeschool history curriculum website for grades 6 through 12 that teaches the Socratic method in history. So it's geared towards teaching students how to become critical thinkers rather than just people who regurgitate historical facts. And so they have online classes that they offer to students. They also have, the 32-week curriculum with videos included. And the website is really neat because there are more resources. There are current events that are published and current events that cover many things. There are like lesson samples for history classes. I used to have a blog on the website, so my blog articles are still up there. And there's a new society called the Dolphin Society, which you sign up for, and you have access to many videos, tutorials about teaching history and teaching with a Socratic discussion. And you have access to joining a community of other homeschool parents who are helping their students be more prepared to enter into the world after homeschool life.
Well, it sounds fantastic, and I'm sure that my listeners are going to want to check that out. Again, I will put those links so that you don't have to try to remember. And I just want to thank you, Jessica. I am excited to listen to your podcast because I think many homeschool moms will be interested in inviting, especially their older students, to listen in. You are giving us exposure to people from many different backgrounds, and that's always a good thing. So thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having me on the show. This has been a lovely evening.
To find links to Jessica's podcast and the Classical Historian curriculum, go to homeschoolsanity.com/government. Thanks again to CTC Math for their sponsorship. Join me next time as we discuss how to maintain a strong homeschool marriage. Have a happy homeschool week. Thank you for joining me. Happy, healthy homeschooling can be yours. It begins with one small step. Let's continue the conversation on social media. I'm at Psycho with Six. This has been a production of the Ultimate Homeschool Radio Network.